An expansive imagination is critical to value creation. Business as usual in terms of, oh, we have a subject matter expert and then we're going to bring this to market in 6 months and here's our customers. No, you better be
Yeah.
ready for everything.
To use Gail's words, this conversation is nothing short of expansive. But if I had to sum it up, it's really about how to cut through the noise, communicate clearly, and tell stories that actually reach people. Gayle Tzemach Lemmon has spent her career moving between worlds as both an outsider and an insider, across early-stage technology company building, finance, foreign policy, politics and journalism, entrepreneurship, and emerging technology. What that's given her is a deeply systems-level way of seeing how the world actually works, not how we wish it did. In this conversation with Sanjeev, Gail talks about why this moment, shaped by the forces of AI, geopolitics, and energy, is forcing a rewrite of what's possible. She makes the case that economics and politics are inseparable, that fairness is one of the most powerful forces shaping markets today, and that homogeneous thinking leads to value destruction. If you're interested in how to think across silos, challenge conventional wisdom, communicate complexity in human language, and navigate an era where uncertainty isn't a bug, but a feature, then this conversation is for you.
Gail, welcome to the S2G podcast.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
You're one of my favorite people. You're one of the most interesting people I know, just given your life experience and everything you've done and everything you're doing right now and areas we've collaborated in the past. For those of people that don't know, maybe a bit of your background, you're obviously, I know you're a builder, company builder, early stage and PE strategy advisor. You've done a lot in foreign policy, former political reporter, investor, 3-time New York Times bestseller, on geopolitics and many things. But maybe just, who are you and how have you gotten here? Kind of like the story of your life.
Yes. No, I mean, I think, look, I have had the gift of being an outsider for a long time in a lot of different spaces. And I think what has taught me a lot about this moment is that seeing things differently is actually a gift. I came from a single mom in PG County, Maryland. My mom worked at the phone company when there was a phone company, Sanjeev, and sold Tupperware at night, and really taught me about hard work, but really about being flexible and seeing what was around corners. Because I think when you have a lot of economic insecurity, when you're growing up, it teaches you to see what's coming next because you need the next opportunity. And that has actually been the biggest gift for me, because I think it just gives you a relentlessness if you're fortunate enough to grow up with incredible role models who are able to find opportunity in adversity.
Yeah.
It really teaches you to always look for where is the opportunity and where is the world headed. And that sort of served me into multiple lives across multiple sectors, as you just mentioned. And really all with the idea always of like, how do we capture imagination to move toward the goal? Right? How do we unlock capital? How do we capture people's imagination? How do we get people to buy an idea? How do we get people to buy a book? When I worked in financial services, like how do we build products that are the right products for the right customer, right? And so it's always about thinking, where is the fit with where the world is headed and what you're offering? And always working on, how do I capture people's imagination in a way that makes them really feel inspired and energized to make the purchase.
So you graduated college. What'd you do?
I worked in news, but my first job was booking crews for the BBC.
Oh, wow.
And,
okay.
Right. So they would need a crew and we would give them the crew. And then I went to CBS News. Yeah. And then from CBS to ABC, sort of went from there. That was kind of the first chapter. And that was when I covered politics. And we worked on this thing called The Note, which was one of the first political newsletters at the ABC News political unit. And then I worked for George Stephanopoulos when he launched the Sunday Show.
And what was your, as you reflect on that part of your life and career, like what are the things you take away as lessons learned or skills that you got or perspectives that you got?
Yeah, so I went to CNN.com for its first presidential election, and everybody told me that was career suicide because nobody would ever get their news from that .com thing.
Yeah.
And it really taught me that, going back to being the gift of the outsider is like, I wasn't scared about going to CNN.com because it wasn't like I had, 4 decades of career to worry about. And I knew it was going to be so hard to get an opportunity in the established world that I could go to the new media, the new technology, learn it, and then go back and transport those skills to whatever I did next. So I think the one thing is to embrace the fearlessness that I grew up with. Right. And the second thing is that politics trumps everything.
Yeah.
Right. And later, working in private sector, it was always stunning to me that people would say, oh, but that's just political. And I was like, I don't think you understand. That's going to kill everything
Did
that you
you,
want to do.
I'm going to tie all this together as we move here, but one, at the risk of kind of foreshadowing, I love what you just said about politics sort of rules everything.
Yeah.
You know, based on, last week's speeches, or I think it was last week, World Economic Forum, God, it's gone by. There's this notion that, Thatcher and Reagan brought in this wave and of shareholder supremacy,
Yeah.
particularly over manager supremacy in capital markets. And then really, though, that period at some point is ending or ended in politics and geopolitics become. And we'll get into this later, but did you anticipate when you were there that like politics is going to be much greater portion of our lives? I mean, you could argue always has been, but it's so endemic now, not just in culture, but increasingly in markets.
Yeah.
Versus there was a whole debate for that Thatcher and Reagan sort of spawned, and effectively even between Blair and Clinton kind of embraced that, like, hey, markets are markets and politics is politics. Did you
Yeah.
anticipate when you were in that world that
Yes. I never believed that I didn't understand, but because I think this goes back to the people who win are the people who can see across silos.
right?
And we've had a moment, and you and I have talked about this, and I know we talked about this at Summit, where there was this aberration where everybody could live in a hermetically sealed bubble
Yeah,
and everything could just keep going, right? And people thought that that was the norm rather than the exception.
yeah,
Um, I grew up in a union household. I remember I worked for Steny Hoyer when and they said NAFTA no. All of the
yeah,
Ross Perot stickers used to come in, and I never thought that you could divorce economic outcomes from the political moment, because at the end of the day, politics is really about the people who govern and people who are in power globally, no matter where you are in the world, like to stay in power. And so they go to understand the moment. And as the moment changes, politics transform, but they don't ever go away.
yeah. It increasingly seems like it's part of identity and religion almost. Like it's. We'll get into that. So you left
Yes,
media.
and
What did you?
absolutely. I think we're in this moment of corners where
Yeah,
it is religion. Yeah, I left, and then I left to go to Spain on a Fulbright and to go to Germany on a Robert Bosch fellowship, and then finally I left ABC News to go to Harvard Business School.
and so you wanted to enter the world of business, commerce, or how, what? Yeah,
Yes, and I also believed. Listen, I grew up with a lot of people who were looking for jobs.
yeah,
And I was fascinated by the idea of like, what does it take to create a job?
right,
Because I understood the dignity that work gives and the loss of dignity that being out of work
yeah,
immediately poisons your life, right? I mean, I watched that firsthand with my father, and I watched it with a lot of people I grew up with. And I thought, I really want to understand why business works the way it does, why capital flows the way it does. I understand the political piece, but I don't understand the economics piece and the markets piece. And so that was why business school was such a joy for me, was to learn. Now, first 3 months, they used verbs that were nouns and nouns that were verbs. Literally every second, I was like, wait a minute, what did they say? And then I would go back and be like, oh, that's actually just like common sense. It's
yeah,
just a different language. And I had the privilege already of speaking different languages. So once I thought about it as a different language, then it was the same ideas, but in a different language. And I also realized there was real alpha you could generate if you take conventional wisdom from one sector and bring it to another.
yeah,
Because things that are entirely common sense when it comes to my previous life in media were very different when I went to financial services, right? And so that was a real gift. But I went to business school really to understand, how do you create growth? How do you manufacture hope, which is what growth does?
And then after business school, you went into
I
finance,
went to
financial
PIMCO.
services.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
went, and I was always trying to have multiple lives. So I was at PIMCO for a number of years. I was in the executive office. I worked with an incredible leader, Bill Thompson, and then for another incredible leader, Mohammed Al Arian. Worked in emerging market product management in between, and really during the financial crisis, Washington was relevant again, and the day of the TARP vote. Uh, One of the amazing MDs said to me, Gail, so that's why TARP is going to pass. And I was sort of, I hadn't quite had my second cup of coffee. It starts
Yeah.
very early in Newport Beach at the time. And so I was honest. And I said, no, there's no way that's going to pass, because if that's the worst vote anybody could take, right? There's absolutely no reason why somebody would vote for TARP from the member level, right? And so everybody looked at me
To
like I was,
me, in some ways, I'm not sure we've fully recovered from 9/11 globally, and in some ways, I don't think we've fully recovered from that vote.
I totally agree with you. And I also think that, and Muhammad would say this, and this is something I thought about, we talked about it, I was like, when you have um, socialized losses and privatized gains,
Exactly.
it's a deeply challenging moment that reinforces this idea of us versus them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but really, it effectively defined, it brought to life, what capitalism had evolved to, which is this notion of, you know, like it's do we really have capitalism or do we have crony capitalism? And I think that set a wave of both left, right corners of this distrust of capitalism because, ideally, you know, you don't have socialized losses and privatized gains. And I actually think about that a lot because, if that is actual capitalism, is that what we want?
And I think this whole idea of fairness,
Yeah.
and you hear it in the politics today, that is a thread that runs through. And it was when I grew up with, my mom was a union, CWA,
Yeah.
union household, right? And I remember being on picket lines with her when I was a kid. That was, and in that point we had healthcare that was 100% covered. So my mother
Yeah.
said, no matter how bad the job is, I always have comfort that if you need braces, it's 100% covered. And
Yeah.
that was, I mean, I remember that to this day, right? How many people can say that
Yeah.
today, Sanjeev, right? So there is this fairness piece that keeps showing up and that will keep showing up.
Before we leave PIMCO, I've always thought of this James Carville quote, like when I die, I want to come back as the bond market. And PIMCO was sort of a navigator of that market for many, many people. Like, how do just as a niche question, I guess, just for my own edification, like how, maybe talk about for people that don't know how sort of influential they were in the bond market and how
Yeah.
maybe would you still agree with that quote about the importance,
Oh,
obviously,
look
with,
at today. I
yeah,
don't think it's any different today, Sanjeev.
yeah,
I truly do not think it's any different today. Both Wall Street and including the bond market are just incredible. Equities and the bond market are incredibly influential in this political
and
moment.
seem more and more correlated versus back in the day they weren't as correlated.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, look, and PIMCO, the founders were there, and it took very seriously, and it continues to take very seriously its role in managing other people's money. And I think there's a sobriety to that and a seriousness to that. And a real desire to be multidisciplinary. It's why somebody who came
Yeah.
from news and then went to Harvard Business School could go and have an amazing run, was because they would always say, you would go in and challenge conventional wisdom and say, look, like, I don't see it that way. And here are the 5 reasons why. Here are the 3 reasons influencing that. And here are the 2 variables in
Yeah.
this decision tree. And it didn't matter whether
But
you'd just gotten there or whether you'd been
one
there for 10 years.
but I think it's an important like life experience because if you look at 300 to 800 years of history of bond markets, particularly like 300 years, they do have an influence. And I think even the moment we are in, the spending from governments and to pay unfunded liabilities or to finance sort of aging and other things, it's going to have a feedback loop in places that we don't think about. The level of spending that governments are going to have to do for whatever reason, military, aging, et cetera, is not stopping. and at some point, it's either going to be monetized away, I imagine, or there's a real set of unintended consequences that come up, including, I think, challenging sort of the assumptions around modern portfolio theory and how sort of the modern capital market and portfolio constructions work. I don't know if, I know I said a lot there, but I don't know.
No, but think about this. Like, to me, some of the themes, and you and I frequently discuss this, is trust, credibility, and confidence in the future.
Yeah.
Right? The bond market is built on those.
Yeah.
And the question is, what happens if you start to pull at the threads?
Yeah.
And
particularly at the 10-year, 30-year, and the longer duration stuff.
That's right. And that's why I think, look, there is conversations going on about a Mar-a-Lago Accord. There's conversations going on about a number of proposals that people might previously not have thought were possible. And this is a moment where you need a new imagination, right? If you take a Mad Lib and write down everything that you would write right before the Mad Lib is the blank line and then can't happen, you need to go back to that Mad Lib, make that whole list, and take away the T and can't.
Yeah.
And really think through what the decision tree should include today.
After PIMCO, what'd you do?
I went to Council on Foreign Relations. So I was at Council on Foreign Relations, really writing a lot. I had an incredible journey at PIMCO and really left because I had a first book coming out about a teenager whose business supported her family under the Taliban. So I was going back and forth to Afghanistan from Newport Beach.
How did you come up with that story?
Well, I was there actually during business school.
Okay.
I was at BP for the summer, actually, and almost went back to BP full time. And then I went to Rwanda.
Oh, wow. Okay.
For the last 2 weeks of the summer to interview entrepreneurs and write about them. And I wrote this piece for the FT that was about this incredible entrepreneur who was making baskets with women whose husbands had perpetrated the genocide and women whose husbands had been killed in the genocide. And they were selling them at Macy's department store in New York.
Oh, wow.
And it ended up being the front page of the FT's entrepreneurship section, which they had at that time. And one of my professors at Harvard Business School said, "That's an amazing story. Like, what do you want to do next? Like, we'll support, we're very supportive of this,
Yeah.
And I said, well, if you're going to write about entrepreneurship, if you're going to look for women who own small and medium enterprises, like, the story is Afghanistan. And so, I had the privilege of going there and I was in the course of just scouring the city of Kabul and talking to a lot of entrepreneurs. I met this extraordinary person who had a business that had supported her neighborhood under the Taliban. And she actually became an entrepreneur because the Taliban took away every other option. And that's how she kept not only her family, but families all around her neighborhood afloat. And actually, some of the Taliban sent their daughters to work with her because they needed the money too. Back to where we started, which is economics and politics cannot be divorced from one another.
What was did you at Council on Foreign Relations, or what was your sort of focus areas
We did a lot on economic development, and how it intersects with geopolitics and the role of women, economic development and how it intersects with access to capital. How hard is it to get access to capital in very tough parts of the world? Why is it that hard when it should be easy in a place where you really need entrepreneurs who are fighting against every obstacle to build businesses that will be there the next day? Why do we make the cost of capital 27% or 23%, right? You couldn't do that in Chicago.
Yeah.
Right. And so it was writing a lot about that and trying to basically giving the same speech 177 times and still mostly banging my head against cement, talking to people about, these are the growth engines. Yeah. These are the people we need to reduce aid dependency, to increase growth. And these are the people fighting every single day for stability. And I wanted to take it a step further and really get people to not think micro when it came to women, to try to think about the small and medium. It's just very hard in those environments for everybody. Doesn't matter who you are, to start a small, medium enterprise that grows because it's very expensive. Capital is scarce and capital is expensive, and frictions that exist can be daunting. So I was really trying to get roadblocks out of the way, or to use a bowling analogy, to try to get pins out of the lane.
Yeah.
for entrepreneurs in
Did
think tank.
it give you an insight on sort of where geopolitics was evolving? Because my notion, and going back to the statement of, I'm not sure we've recovered from 9/11, was
Yeah.
I feel like I'm a big believer in Hegelian dialectics, and post 9/11, it was a very much interventionist sort of, willing to be, without a lot of debate, financier of collective security, because that was much more tied to, and then the theory of change was obviously around, sort of, because of the origins of 9/11 around, the Middle East and that genre. Um, but did it give you an insight of, like, I think my sort of interpretation today was we overextended. We effectively created a generation of folks that felt like the burden sharing was almost had gone
Yeah.
too far in one direction, and it's created this sort of bipartisan dynamic of, you know, maybe we shouldn't finance collective security to the extent that we do. Um, did you get that ruminations, or is it still more we're in the middle of, prosecuting, and no one could lose an election because of an attack, or there was not a lot of debate about
You know,
the
I
the role of burden sharing and the financing of it?
So I guess two things. One is it inspires you because you meet so many incredible people fighting
Yeah,
against every obstacle imaginable. And people don't live in geopolitics. People
right.
live lives. And that's very easy to forget
Yeah,
when you're in DC. And I used to joke frequently that there's much more hope in tougher places than there is in Washington.
yeah,
And so on the one hand, you had a very keen sense of the gap between the macro and the micro
right.
and the way people's lives are lived. And on the other hand, you really did feel um, that afterward, that the ghost of Iraq and Afghanistan hung over every decision made. And that goes far as today,
Yeah,
right? The ghost of Iraq and Afghanistan really shape the decisions that people are making and the collective exhaustion that a lot of people feel. And, look, less than 1% of the country fought 20% of its, I'm sorry, less than 1% of the country fought 100% of its wars for 20 years.
yeah.
So there's also the exhaustion that came from those who were asked to serve. And there's certainly exhaustion from those who lived on the ground. But I think that it cannot be underestimated, the lessons that period gave to this next generation of
I think
leaders.
rightly and wrongly, it also said why we're doing nation building abroad, we should do nation building here, and then it gave an opening, because I think while we were trying to do nation building, or whatever you want to call it, potentially in Iraq and Afghanistan, the perception was, China's focused on China and growth. Europe spends more, on sort of safety nets and safeguards than
Yeah.
necessarily military spending relative to its GDP. And so I think it led to this notion of, like, which, you know like, it gave an opening for more multipolarity, and then it gave like a introspection on the definition of unipolarity. I don't know if you'd agree with that or
Yeah,
not.
so, and I'd say two things on that. One is if you listen to Secretary Besant's interview with Human Events from Davos, he actually talks, like, it really gets to a lot of these conversations. You can trace a direct line. And I've had conversations with people who are part of the transition to this administration, really
Hmm.
having these conversations. There is a direct line between those conflicts and the moment that we're in, and also this notion of fairness, right? Of the
Yeah,
idea and really interpreted in different ways, but the same kind of frame of underlying notion
yeah,
that's informing the politics. The second piece is that you saw it on the ground. It looked very different
right.
on the ground, right? And you wanted to try to show that the economic possibility that people were fighting for, the stability that people were fighting for every single day against all the obstacles. And so both of those truths were existing.
Yeah,
Could see that that was the political horizon that was coming. And I think that was the one thing that really, being a political reporter, my very first life, many moons back, really taught me to listen and always have your ear to the ground. The danger is in not paying attention and imagining the world is as you wish it versus as it is.
So, because I think I'm going to tie this all together at the end, but you got sort of media and politics, you have markets and commerce, you have sort of geopolitics and people, which
Yeah.
are barbells of you know. Um, what did you do after that? Or
Yeah, and then I mean, then I've had like this whole um, kind of privilege of a journey to be able to write books, to work in early stage technology, now be advising a number of early stage companies, and now be really working in a visual AI uh, company that is adding to the perception layer of AI. And so it's this marriage of understanding where the world was and where the world is headed, and being able to look from the outsider's perch
yeah,
at both of them. And, I think so writing books teaches you to read a room even better, right?
yeah,
Because every time you give a book talk, it must be like stand-up comedy, as
yeah,
Sanjeev.
yeah,
Every room is different. You have the feel of where people are, where they're going, and you really try to take a personal story and make it universal.
yeah,
Um, and I think with emerging technology, the whole idea is how do you build trust and make it relevant and useful to people's lives, always with trust at the center. And how do you build an enduring company that means something to people? And I think the enduring piece and the values piece is one you have to think about all the time.
You brought up noun, verb, adjective, AI. Um, um, what is your view of um, that word?
Yeah, it's become a Rorschach test, hasn't it?
Yeah, it
Right?
has.
It's sort of what
I'm
everybody.
not. I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's gonna. I think it's becoming more and more under scrutiny as well.
For sure. But this goes back to where we started the conversation. If you want to think about where this moment is, right? If you think about the idea of fairness, and if you think the idea of um, is it more for more or more for fewer?
Hmm.
This all comes back to what does the economy mean for me? And then this comes, then if you drive forward, and you and I talk about systems investing all the time, then it goes back even one step further to um, what do I have to believe to make this investment
Yeah.
make sense? And let's go beyond that to even be alpha creating, right? Be alpha inducing. And if we have this moment where people don't feel they have a stake in growth, it becomes incredibly challenging to sell them on the vision of it.
Yeah.
I believe that AI is going to be both incredibly helpful for outsiders, and that it puts the tools in everybody's hands. So the gatekeepers have transformed.
Yeah.
And then also deeply challenging because um, scale is everything.
Well, it's this bifurcation. Is it techno utopia or techno feudalism?
Yes,
Um,
and does it have to be one or the other, right?
for
Because
sure.
everybody's living in corners right now. I deeply believe that it is going to be a transformative technology that reshapes in ways that we don't know yet, right? Uh,
Exactly.
and that also um, it will be in our best interest for people to understand the why. And
Yeah.
I just, if we look at what leaders need in this moment, we need iceberg language, not arugula.
Yeah.
One of the biggest challenges we've had is that people haven't felt like people have somehow taken complex as a synonym for smart,
Yeah.
and speaking in ways that um, make a lot of sense at the greenbelt highs,
Yeah. Yeah.
or
Yeah.
at the 7-Eleven is actually really a good idea, not just for political stability but for economic growth.
Yeah. Like it's one of those things. It's hard to put something on one page as opposed to 90 pages.
Yes, well, exactly. And also, we have placed currency on multisyllabic as a synonym for intellectual.
Right. Right. Um, so I want to bring this all back because I think why I'm so excited to always talk to you. I'd like to talk to you more, but we're both busy. And why you wanted you in our podcast, in our ecosystem, and to collaborate with you is, to me, you're like your career has been the living embodiment of what we're focused on in terms of, as you know, these five core
Yes, for sure.
pillars that we sort of define and brand as the age of adaptation. That
Yeah.
it's good. The world's moving from CPU to GPU, shorthand for AI, from a unipolarity to a multipolarity with geopolitical dimensions. and dominoes that we don't know fully, from a declining price of money to an unknown price of money. And I really start with Nixon as the
Yes,
architect
I
of the
agree with
modern
that.
world, as you
Yeah.
know. And then the fourth is, sort of entropy. So climate heating from 1.5 to something to 2.5, and then aging. And it is my thesis, and I'm curious to hear your view on it, is these five, the cocktail of all these five is going to change beta and alpha.
Yeah.
We've talked about alpha a bunch. In every sort of, I don't know, 50 to 80 years, beta changes. Do you think, just curious, and you should very much feel free to disagree, but
Always.
but these five and perhaps others, we're at a moment where for investors, company builders, policymakers, like if you really internalize like the system level outsider view of all five of these and perhaps others, like trying to underwrite sort of your
Yes.
view of beta and alpha, like just be
Yeah.
careful. And I've obviously think beta is going to change and more structurally than people, most ICs and most sort of investment incentives allow people to do. But I don't know. How do you react to that?
I think that homogeneous thinking is going to lead to value destruction right now.
Right.
And you really need multidisciplinary approaches. And I think you and Chuck and Aaron talked about this on your preview of
Yeah.
2026. And, that you have to be sober. And this is what I mean about the Mad Lib, right? You need to put a blank for
Yeah.
a hole, right? And then can't happen. And then go back and write everything you think that can happen.
Yeah.
Question every single one of them. Take the T off, what can happen, and then also do the thought experiment of where that leads.
Yeah.
Because we are really in a moment of wet cement. It is not yet hardened, and we're watching real transformations happen. I think the five that you mentioned very much in play, and then I would also think about back to if you think that you're moving from the folks in asset light industries going into asset heavy industries, right?
Right.
From folks who from this idea of globalization to the now the nation is our heartthrob, right? Everybody's going back to it. Then what does that mean for resource allocation, and what does that mean for resource sovereignty?
Right.
Which is a huge theme that I think hasn't been explored enough. But yes, alliances will matter, but everybody thinks that they also need to do it themselves, because when there is less trust on the chessboard, everybody has to make sure that they have every piece.
Yeah.
Also.
I think what I've struggled with is, like, how do you tell this in a way that is iceberg versus arugula? Like,
Yeah.
like it's just been a struggle for me to be like, I believe multidisciplinary thing. I believe in systems thinking, which is to me the art of first, second, and third order thinking applied to real things. And then obviously what we're trying to build is a system investing firm that underwrites
Correct.
this. And
what you have built. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that's what we continue to evolve and try to get better at every day. But like a food underwriting, a grid underwriting, a logistics, supply chain. I mean, yeah, it's about the management team, that P&L, really understanding, the structure that but like, there's some things that you still need to pay attention to. If the 10 years 6% rather than 3, no matter what happens, your exit multiple is going to be impacted because the price of money often drives multiple expansion or multiple contraction. It's nothing to do with any industry, sector, company. And so there's these larger forces that are systemic that, again, in a micro underwrite of a company that's in the grid services industry or in supply chain, you got to but I think, how do we get to the iceberg of these systems issues that I think most people, because it's not iceberg, people are like, I read about it in the headlines and I don't know. How do you, because you are an outsider, you're a storyteller, you understand these different worlds as we've just come to learn in the podcast, but how do we get iceberg about systems thinking, interdisciplinary thinking?
So one thing I remember joking with my bosses at PIMCO about is, and I learned very early watching like the best account managers at PIMCO is like nobody likes to be bored. So I always
Right.
start from first principles, right? What can people not be against? And nobody likes to be bored.
Okay.
And so then the framing I have used for a lot of this is this whole idea of this is the age of age, AI, geopolitics, and energy,
Okay.
and get people underneath to understand that this is um, a trio of Grammy winners that don't necessarily sing in harmony,
Right.
but they have to work together to make some music because AI is going to determine the shape of geopolitics and it requires energy. Energy will determine geopolitical dominance and is required for AI. Geopolitics will, large part, be shaped by AI supremacy and energy sovereignty and security, right?
Yeah.
And so to me, it's like, can you start with a framing and a prism that people can then say, okay, I get those, right? I may not agree with you on all three, but it gives me a framing.
Yeah.
And then I just go deeper and deeper using, I think, maybe that's where growing up in PG County and going to Denny's and getting my, cheese sticks every Friday, was taught me a lot about like just listening to people and how they talk, right? And you have to have deep respect for where people are. The reason why sometimes things are really complicated for people is people have to figure out, how am I going to take care of my kids? How am I going to pay for sports?
Yeah.
How am I going to, I have 10 things to do between now and the time I listen to you talk about systems thinking, Gail. Like, that's great, but I mean,
Yeah.
come
Yeah.
on, right? And so it's more about
But
how.
Maslow's hierarchy is entangled with those three things too.
That's it. 100%. 100%. Having been in places and privileged of being in places where energy was scarce
Yeah.
and electricity was almost non existent, right? You realize its role in stability, security, and economic opportunity. And so to go back to your question, I do think it is about meeting people where they are and framing it, the ideas that you're working to communicate based on how they see the world and what folks are facing every day.
So let's move from system thinking, which I think your outsider sort of um, perspective, I think, has led you to have high conviction. How many system thinking principles are being applied to investing today, in your view? Like,
I would ask you that question. I mean, I do think people look. I think they're just incredibly smart people, many of whom you know, and many of whom I went to business school with, and a lot of people I talk to regularly. There are, but I think there's also the hype cycle is hard to ignore,
right.
and that is why I think it's always critical to separate noise from signal. Always. And it's very hard. And it's getting increasingly, and I would say exponentially harder,
Yeah.
because the cycle is quick wins, fast returns, triple digit alpha,
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And it's hard to be sober when
Yeah.
the champagne is flowing.
Yeah.
And so to me, it is where I always come back to is, who are the investors who can put the volume on zero and do their
Yeah.
work? And it's why I've always followed Berkshire. It's why you follow people who say we build for more than the next, 2.5 minutes until the commercial break in old school
Yeah.
parlance, or, 15 seconds until the next video shows up in new media world.
Um, where are we going? Where are we in 2026? Where are we going? We've obviously had a very exciting January geopolitically, even today with the Fed being announced, with the sort of what Claude bought, and sort of as we sit here in sort of January 26th. Like, I feel like all of the things you guys talked about, geopolitics, energy, AI, just in January, it feels like a year.
It does, right?
So if January feels like a year, are we just going to have more of these with those three things that you're focused on: AI, energy, and geopolitics? Where are we going?
I think uncertainty is a feature,
Yeah.
not a bug. And there's a Buddhist teaching I've been listening to. I was teaching about making friends with fear and getting comfortable with discomfort and getting comfortable with fear. And um, I really think that there is possibility and opportunity
Hmm.
in upheaval, but you have to have a strong stomach, and you have to have the values that motivate you, kind of front and center. And so it really is, to your question about investing and when you're underwriting a company, is do you have a team that has more than mono thinking at its heart, right? And do you
Yeah.
have a team that understands that real buffers have to be built in, that scenario planning, that resilience is not something that can be excluded from the model.
Yeah. One thing I want to, just because I've grown up in financial services, and to me, a lot of financial services is CYA on the way down. It's like, all right, like, everyone has a incentive structure, CYA, and so, the past is the future, the brand is the brand, like knows no, like, yes, like it's a bit of a herd mentality, that structure.
Yeah.
I believe if you're going to go from the era of moderation to the modern era of volatility, uncertainty, CYA actually has to be bottom up. Which what I mean is at board meetings, at management team meetings, at like portfolio construction has never been more important, and it's bottom up because even something like there's a seed stage company that was trying to figure out their supply chain, and they're like,
Yeah.
what's China going to do with X or Y? What's the US going to do with China? And there's like, how do I manage inventory? And I was like, I'm reading I'm reading Foreign Policy magazine. I'm
Yeah.
going to this. I'm like, to make an inventory decision, you're reading geopolitics.
Yeah.
But like that management team and that CEO was like, no, I'm figuring out my working capital inventory dynamics, and geopolitics gets involved. And then even at what we do, it's like, all right, portfolio company X or company I, fine. But like,
Yeah.
you have to think about portfolio construction, because the risk that's levered to can't be the risk that every other company's levered
That's
to,
right.
because then you're fully levered to one set of risks in the portfolio. So I don't know if I'm being articulate with the
No,
CYA
for
being,
sure.
yeah,
Here's my arugula reading of my read back. Right, I
yeah,
worked with an amazing CTO who would always read back to me
yeah,
what I had said, and I think an expansive imagination is critical to value creation.
yeah,
Right, and that's how what I would say was that business as usual in terms of, oh, we have a subject matter expert, and then we're going to bring this to market in 6 months, and here's our customers. No, you better be
yeah,
ready for everything. And you have to have modeled it out. You have to put volatility and turbulence into the model.
yeah.
It is not enough to say, "Oh yeah, we thought about it." Right? Like
Inventory, working capital, access to
downside
debt,
scenario planning, upside
equity,
scenario
everything. Yeah,
planning,
yeah,
and it also means that storytelling is critical because it's so noisy that and we've watched media be face real challenges. So individual companies' voices
yeah,
are ever more important. The content piece of the voice, the authenticity, the trust that people have in a company that they build through what they write, through how they go out in the world, that becomes even more important because it becomes a differentiator in an ever more noisy world where mainstream media is not always going to give you the return that it might have, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. Right. And so portfolio construction becomes a much more expansive exercise,
yeah,
and one that requires decision trees that go into different forests than they might have previously, but that have to be done with real discipline,
yeah.
real rigor.
This inventory question, it was like so like it was like it's very specific.
Yeah,
I was like, you need to have a portfolio approach to this inventory decision, because it's like if you just have one approach, it's probably the cheapest from a unit economic
it's
perspective,
correct.
but you're going to sacrifice some margin, and um, but then you're hedged if this happens or this happens or this happens, and
Your buffer could be your savior.
yeah,
This is the world we're in, right? Because you don't know with policy turbulence and different countries with different policies and potentially bilateral relationships transforming in more rapid moments than they had
yeah,
previously. You have to be ready. And this is what I mean that it has to be in the model, right? The expansive thinking about the possibility set
yeah.
and then drill down to the rigor of what does that mean for an individual company.
And this is sort of the art and science of anti-fragile company building in sort of the 21st century, where like volatility ends up making you outperform and not
That's
just,
correct.
it's not a cost. And that's probably a whole nother podcast that you should come back for. Because
Exactly.
I do think like things like that will help you build anti-fragility potential, but then at the same time, there's some fragility to that. So I think it's very much an art. What you've done so many different things as you bring it to close. This I've seen a theme of outsider um, in a lot of what you do that's allowed you to be multidisciplinary systems thinker, but at the same time, simplicity in storytelling, really understanding sort of people and not just all these other sort of esoteric and sometimes opaque things that influence people's lives, both known and unknown. But I want to end this podcast with you were also an insider. I mean, you were booking guests in very
For
influential
sure. I mean,
circles. You
it's hard to
were,
be,
uh,
as my great aunt used to say, it's hard to be a Fulbright scholar and a Harvard Business School graduate, and then say you're an outsider. Yeah,
yeah. But you being an insider and with an outsider's heart or DNA, maybe just talk a little bit about what you learned from, because I think the perception of insiders today has never been more critiqued. The sort of the elites and sort of what's happening and but on the corners. But maybe just talk about lessons learned from like being on the inside for folks. Is in the way that they relate to things around problem solving or the ability to kind of storytell. Like what was you've been exposed to? You're being very humble. You know a lot of people and a lot of people that have done a lot of things. Is there a through line and lessons learned for our audience, our entrepreneurs, our management teams, our leaders, our fellow sort of travelers of sort of the things that your mentors and things that have done us, like any sort of life lessons for people?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many, and maybe I'll go back to, and then I'll go forward.
Yeah.
So I think the risk with all the conversation about affordability is that was actually the last fight,
Yeah.
and people aren't looking ahead to what's next. And I think this is the next conversation is what is facing families
Yeah.
and how do families make it economically, and this is globally.
Yeah.
Right? How do they get through? How do families who are working figure out how to make a life that feels like it has a stake in the system? So back to systems level thinking, right? You have to also think about who is taking part in the system and how and why do we keep that together, right? How do we keep that moving forward, and how do we keep shared security, stability, and prosperity as a
And
goal?
that's sort of the North Star of a lot of
That's
this.
right.
Yeah.
Right. And then in terms of, yes, I have had a privilege uh, of a career and really worked with people who taught me a lot. And I probably learned the most from my mom, who used to say, on a scale of major world tragedies, yours is not a 3. Okay, I don't want to hear it. Nobody cares. And actually, I had never talked about my family. I never talked about, when my mom was sick with breast cancer when I was 10 and passed when I was 13. And when I was 11 or 12, we went to apply for food stamps because she was trying to figure out if her union job was going to make it and what benefits would be. And I was so embarrassed. And the biggest thing that it taught me was that, like, all these things I had been embarrassed to talk about when I was first becoming an insider or entering these rooms, actually you realize are the superpower
Yeah.
that you have, which is you grow up in the norm of scarcity and constraint. And I think we are in this world, and you and Chuck talked about this on the podcast previewing the year, right? If you think scarcity and constraint are norms that are going to stay, they engender a huge amount of creativity. And that was the biggest lesson I had from the people I grew up with and the people actually I worked with afterward. And I don't want to downplay trauma in any way, but I would say in any way, and everybody's experience is so different. I would say, though, that adversity drives opportunity, and that ability to be resilient is a gift.
Thank you for tuning in to the S2G podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, or share it with a friend. For more information or to connect with us, check out s2ginvestments.com.